Welcome to another episode of the Exhale Podcast, a candid conversation about current matters relating to respiratory, diagnostic, and lung health. Today's hosts are Mark Russell, Marketing Communications Manager, and Troy Pridgeon, Executive Vice President of Sales and Operations for Vitalgraph in North America, a global leader in respiratory diagnostics. Today, we had a delightful conversation with Teresa Barnes. She's a nonprofit executive and the co-founder of a medtech startup, Fluid IQ. She's a consultant, expert, and advocate for pulmonary patients and researchers with a particular interest in fibrotic lung disease. The most common form of the condition, however, is idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, IPF. It's a devastating and nearly always fatal disease that affects about 128,000 people in the United States. Each year, about 48,000 new cases are diagnosed and about 40,000 deaths are recorded, around the same number as attributed to breast cancer.
Well, Teresa, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, please give our audience a little background on yourself, education, experience, and current responsibilities.
Sure. So, I'm an accidental advocate, I like to say. I was a journalist, and my dad was diagnosed with pulmonary fibrosis when I was a senior in college. And it was a bit of a blur because I'd never heard of the disease, and it was shocking to me that a man in his late 50s had no tools available to him and no way of surviving the disease. Ultimately, he was transplanted. He did not survive the transplant, but it was a huge life changer for me and for the rest of my family. And subsequently, over a 10-year period, all four of his brothers and his sister died also from pulmonary fibrosis. So, the short version of the story is I sort of sidetracked my journalism career and started focusing on this problem. And I worked for one of my dad's transplant surgeons, starting medical device companies, and simultaneously started the first pulmonary fibrosis nonprofit back in 2001. And then today, I feel like grown up in this space. I've served in almost every standing committee of the American Thoracic Society. I chaired their public advisory roundtable. I've worked with different government agencies and researchers around the country, and I still believe that we are going to find treatments and a cure for this disease, which is why when Bill Vick, the founder of PF Warriors, invited me to come and join the organization, I wholeheartedly jumped in to help. So I'm excited to be part of PF Warriors.
Well, I'm certainly sorry that you had those experiences, but it does sound like you're making the most of it, really trying to do some good out there in the world and promote awareness of what pulmonary fibrosis is. For the benefit of our listeners, could you tell us, really what is pulmonary fibrosis exactly, and what's it like for someone who's been diagnosed with this disorder?
We're still learning what pulmonary fibrosis is, but what we know is that it is a fibrotic disease that is progressive. And for different people, it progresses at a slower or faster rate. It basically scars the lung tissue. And over time, patients end up with more scar tissue than they do functional lung tissue. And that's really unfortunate. And there's not really anything we can do to stop that from happening. We can't prevent it from happening. We can't stop it once it's underway. There are therapies out there that we may be able to slow the disease with, but we still have no cures. And transplant is the only option for really taking the disease away as far as we have right now. It's the kind of disease that everyone's journey is a little different. And I think that patients being very proactive in their care once they've been diagnosed is really important to how they're going to live their lives.
That's very interesting. I know we've heard a lot about pulmonary fibrosis, especially with regards recently to the PACT Act and the veterans who were exposed to burn pits and things of that nature. Is pulmonary fibrosis something that is normally a environmental impact, or is it genetic? Are people predisposed to it, or both?
It's a really good question, and it's sort of a chicken or the egg right now. We know that there are people that are predisposed to the disease, families similar to mine that may have genetic predisposition, and some that don't even know that they do may have genetic predisposition. And in fact, we believe that the environmental exposures may sort of awaken the disease in a lot of people. And so when you look at situations like Iraq and Afghanistan and the burn pits and so forth, perhaps our lungs, what we think is that our lungs over our lifetimes can sort of take a number of hits, so to speak. So, maybe you can take a number of illnesses, pneumonia, being exposed to something in your environment over a period of time before your lungs actually start to have damage or have some sort of illness related to whatever that is, smoking or whatever. But for other people, it may be just one hit, or it may only take the genetic form, or it may only take the environmental impact for someone to develop the disease. We're still figuring all of that out. But what we do know is there are a lot of roads that lead to pulmonary fibrosis, and the burn pits are certainly one. And what we know, I met with the VA probably, 8 or 9 years ago with one of our lead doctors. And at the time, they were talking about a registry and how a lot of soldiers who were returning from Afghanistan and Iraq were signing into the registry, because most soldiers at that time, it was something in the 90 percentile that were returning with lung problems, and a lot of them undefined. And so, we know that there are a lot of people who haven't yet even experienced the disease that they may end up having in the future, and that's unfortunate. But what we do know is that because of the burn pits, because there's been more attention toward it legislatively, at least there's going to be support for patients in the future, which is good.
Well, Teresa, why don't you tell us about the Pulmonary Fibrosis Warrior Program, and is it just for PF patients, or is it for also family members?
That's the beauty of what PF Warriors is doing, is that the disease is really it doesn't strike a single person. It strikes a family. When this disease happens, it really sort of knocks the air out of everyone. And I believe that for that reason, that's why an organization like PF Warriors is so important. And that was what Bill Vick had in mind when he developed this kind of support system for patients. So yes, it's for patients, and yes, it's for families. And yes, it's for, anyone who gives support to someone with the disease, it's for them. And what's great about a lot of what the organization stands for is that it not only does it try to focus on patients, it's made up of patients. Most of the team at PF Warriors, they're either patients themselves or they're family members of patients. And so they really understand what people are facing, what they're dealing with every day, what their challenges are, what they really want, and how they can, potentially live their lives better. And so that's really the focus of the organization. And in order to carry out what we call patients helping patients, there are tools out there. So on our website, which is pfwarriors.com, you just sign up as a member. It's free. And then once you sign up on our website, you have access to lots and lots of tools. There are information brochures that you can download. There are many videos, I'm not even sure how many, lots of interviews over years with different experts on the topics that are important to patients. We have a monthly webinar that people can join every month. There's one every few weeks for people that want to sort of have a support group setting. So it's virtual, but it's still very much like a support group where they can talk about things that are important to them individually as a group. And then there are tools, for every step of a patient's journey, from the point of diagnosis until, the disease is beginning to progress and maybe you need oxygen, or you need more oxygen than you did when you started, or maybe you're starting on drugs in the space, or you're interested in clinical trials, that sort of thing. I mean, we sort of cover, if it's important to patients and families, we probably cover it.
Well, that's fascinating. I was curious, what kind of resources and tools were available to you. What is the membership currently, and is it primarily U.S. based, or is it worldwide?
That's a really good question. We're a growing organization. In fact, we've grown more during the pandemic than in the several years previous. And I think that it just shows how important support is for patients wherever they are. We have thousands. I think the number is hovering around 15 to 20,000 patients, not just in the U.S., although most of them are in the United States, but around the globe. And every time we have a webinar, people type in where they're from. And it's always amazing to see how far our reach has gone and how many patients are responding and using our tools. And in fact, there is a Spanish-speaking PF Warriors version that we have as well for live events and for recordings and for, efforts for people that would like to receive it in if Spanish is their first language. So we're really growing, and we're really excited about the opportunities because of that growth.
Are there any advances on pulmonary fibrosis? I mean, what kind of research and where are we at in helping a lot of these patients?
So yes and no. I'll start with the no. I've been around the space for more than 20 years now, and it depends on how you measure progress. If you measure progress by how many studies there are out there on the disease, how much, I remember looking at research when my dad was diagnosed 20 years ago, and there was really nothing out there. There were, at the time, it was before the first human trial started in IPF. I remember having to go to the Duke Library to figure out on microfiche what had been done before. There just wasn't anything. But today, that's very different, thankfully. We have many resources available to patients if they want to see what kinds of research has been done, what kinds of drugs have been studied, that sort of thing. There's a lot of progress. The NIH has funded pulmonary fibrosis research since the early 2000s, and they continue to do so, and it's growing, which is really positive. We need that. But when it comes to changing the lives of patients every day, to improving quality of life, improving length of life, saving lives, preventing disease, we've got a long way to go. And so, what I believe is that it really takes patients being involved, families being involved, in order for us to change the future. And the biggest challenge we have is that, unfortunately, our patients don't live long sometimes. And on average, it's 3 to 5 years, and that's not very long for them to get involved and stay involved, and for their families to stay involved. So I think the opportunity is this: we've come a long way. There are a number of drugs that are being trialed, but we still struggle. Part of the reason we struggle maybe is because we need more diverse endpoints for our studies. Maybe we need to look at therapies that are used in other diseases. What we know is fibrosis occurs in every organ of the body, not just the lungs. And perhaps looking at a more holistic approach to the disease, looking at other organs and what might be working elsewhere, might be a good thing to do, or to look at opportunities to understand. I know we're looking at immuno-related drugs too. Because of COVID, we suddenly have a lot more resources to study the disease. Because if you look at long COVID, there was a study from Malon Hans University there at University of Michigan, where they looked at pulmonary fibrosis, basically our interstitial lung disease, in patients who had long COVID. And they looked at their health medical records, and they found that the majority of the people with long COVID in the study that they did had underlying interstitial lung disease. So we know that what happens in COVID now, we understand, the more severe form of the disease and even the long form of the disease, it appears that pulmonary fibrosis has reared its ugly head. And so I think perhaps the best thing that could happen out of a really bad situation is that because of that, we're able to find treatments for this disease as well. And that's a win. But we really have to stay focused, and we really have to look at turn every stone and turn it twice, and forget every assumption we've ever had about the disease, and start to be more creative using AI and other tools that are, right in front of us right now to make a significant difference in the space. The time is really now. And I think that with the help of the government, if the government can look at this disease and realize the impact it's having, we've lost 1 million patients since I started in this space 20 years ago, and we can do better than that. And because the disease is not specific just to people who have genetic risk or who have been exposed to burn pits, but now we know that people who have had COVID may be higher risk for the disease, which makes all of America at risk. So I believe that if the government and others can say this is important and we need to focus on pulmonary fibrosis and the cause of the scarring and to find ways to solve this problem, I believe the future is very bright for us. So I guess the long story is we're in a good position today. The other long story is that we've come a long way and we've had a lot of failures, but there's huge room for improvement.
You had mentioned transplants, like in cystic fibrosis. Have you had any successes in patients getting a transplant with their lungs and lasting longer, or possibly having a recurrence of fibrosis?
You know, it's interesting. One, we don't see the recurrence of fibrosis post-transplant. We do have some on our webinar series from PF Warriors website. There is a conversation about that. I'm trying to remember who did that. I want to say it was Paul Noble. May have discussed some of that, but we've got some really good interviews on transplant on there. But my experience, and I still work with patients every day, a lot of them navigating transplant, and it's a journey, and it's different for every patient, and it's changing even as we speak. And I serve on the patient advisory group for the SRTR, which is the group that gathers the data on transplant. And so I've learned a great deal. What I would tell you is transplant is a really wonderful option, but unfortunately it's not an option for all of our patients. Right now in the United States, I believe we're hovering around 2,300 lung transplants a year happen in the United States. And we have, just in pulmonary fibrosis alone, not even considering all the other lung problems that people have that may lead them to need a lung transplant, we have over 200,000 patients. So for most patients, transplant's not going to be a realistic option. But for those that it is, it's a fabulous one. I think overall the outcomes are impressive. And every center, in fact, on the SRTR, I think it's srtr.gov, I should know that, I believe that's right. They have lots of data that's easy to search, and you can actually look at centers in your area. You can compare centers across regions, and I think it is a viable option, and people who can go through that process should consider it. It is definitely something that gives a lot of patients years and a better quality of life. I've got a good friend who had alpha-1 antitrypsin. His name's Lynn Geiger. He's amazing, and he was transplanted more than 20 years ago, and he's doing incredibly well, travels the world and, doing amazingly well. But not every story is that good, and so we need to improve transplant as well. There's opportunity to make that better. I think there are a lot of things in place today that are helping to improve that space, but the rules are changing too. And the lung allocation system for lungs changed just a couple of months ago, 2-3 months ago now. And in fact, the day that the allocation system changed, I got a phone call at like 5 a.m. from a patient's wife, and they had gotten the call for transplant, and they were headed to the center. And 2 hours later, they texted me and said, it sounds like the rules on transplant changed like right now. And luckily for him at that moment, it was prior to the change. So he was waiting on an organ to be transplanted. And as you know, it's a process, and sometimes the organs are not usable. And a few hours passed, and it turned out that the organ was not usable, and he was not transplanted that day. So had he been transplanted that day, he would have fallen under a certain set of rules. Now he's still waiting for his new lung, and the rules are different. And part of that, it includes, and I'm not an expert on all the way the rules operate, but the key part is that there's now more attention to long-term survival post-transplant. And even though it's not hard and fast data, it's not like we know magically how long someone's going to live post-transplant. There's certain factors that are used in making that basically educated guess. And I think for pulmonary fibrosis patients, that might not be a good thing necessarily. I think that our patients, because they're much weaker often at the point of transplant, because their lungs are so severely damaged, there are often other comorbids that they suffer from. So I think, it may not necessarily help our patients in the long run, but I'm hopeful that more and more people will be transplanted over time. Organs are becoming more available, I think, because of systems that perfuse the lungs and allow them to be rehabbed at a center before transplant. There are other advances in other organs, like in heart. Now they can do cold, like transplant, and it's been pretty impressive what they've done. There's also some work on growing human lungs and creating new lungs for patients. And one of those is in Texas. I've been following that closely for probably almost 10 years now. So in the not too distant future, there may be a whole new way of transplanting patients, which could open it up much larger for our patient population.
I tell you, your mission is impressive. It's really great to hear all of this information. Could you tell us, like, where can people, our listeners, find more information about the Pulmonary Fibrosis Warrior Program, and what can they do to support you?
Oh, thank you so much. PF Warriors is pfwarriors.com. You can follow us on social media. We're on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn, and I think we have one on Instagram too. But we're everywhere that most people are on social, for sure. And we have lots of great partners. Three Lakes Foundation, who you probably know, has been a huge supporter of our work. And so we are really excited to work with them and with a lot of the companies that are developing therapies in the disease. And so our goal is to make everything we have available easily to patients. So go to pfwarriors.com. You can reach out to us on any of the social media sites and interact with us there. I've got a LinkedIn page personally. PF Warriors has a LinkedIn page. Reach out to us there. I have a lot of patients that reach out there. We're around, and we want to be there to help you and help your families and help your caregivers, and to make this journey a lot better for you than it probably has been.
Well said, Teresa. Teresa, thank you again for being on our podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Very, very nice to get this invitation, and you're an impressive group. I think this is more than 50 podcasts, right?
That's correct. 51st right now. So we've been doing it for 3 years since COVID, and it's been very successful. We're also now on the Health Podcast Network, which is a network of different podcasts on a variety of different topics and such, and it reaches a lot of healthcare professionals. Again, thank you again.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Exhale Podcast. Don't forget to follow us for upcoming new episodes, and please take our survey to help us provide good content for the future. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to you joining us again on the Exhale Podcast, brought to you by Vitaligraph.